Hello and welcome to PropNext, the property podcast focused on issues that impact the future of the real estate industry. I'm your host, Gavin Morgan, and in addition to looking forward to today's and future conversations, if you'd like to know a little bit more about me, please look on www.propnext.com. That's www.propnext.com. Or if you'd like to chat privately, drop me a line on gavinrmorgan@propnext.com. That's GAVINRMORGAN@propnext.com on email. I'm pleased to welcome Sean Henry, Vice President of Alliance Residential, New England, onto the show today. Sean and I have been good friends and have worked together for, I don't know, Sean, probably about the last 10 years. Something, at least it feels like that. And
yeah, that's for sure.
I'm delighted. I know we've chatted about doing this for a while, so absolutely fantastic to have you on the show today to talk about multifamily, particularly in the sort of northeastern part of the United States where you're based. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Gav. It's always a pleasure to jump on and talk about a shop with someone like yourself.
Oh, good stuff. Well, hopefully it will be fun. And Sean, I thought it'd be good. Could we kick off with maybe just a short intro to you and your career to date in the United States, sort of staying around the areas that you'd like to focus on?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, obviously, currently as a vice president with Alliance Residential here in New England. Prior to that, I was on the LP side with AW Capital Management. And then prior to that, I was with two private developers here around the Boston area. So ultimately, on one side or the other of the same coin, but always been heavily focused around the residential or multifamily development space.
Yeah, Shauna, just straight into that. Obviously you and I have both worked in different parts of the world, but multifamily is not a familiar term to a lot of people. And certainly on this show, we've got a lot of people tuning in from different parts of the world. Maybe just a quick, simple explanation of what multifamily is, please.
Yeah, well, really, it's apartments that you would rent out. But I guess specifically as a focused asset class here in North America, you're generally talking 150, 200 units plus. Not always Class A. We do focus on Class A product, but your typical large scale serviced building with a good healthy host of amenities is really where we focus most of our time.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So yeah, basically on block rental property for living in, and yeah, obviously the multifamily term I think was born and comes out of the United States. And so just going back a few seconds, then you've been around this space a lot in your career, all of your career in real estate. Why do you like multifamily rental housing as an asset class? Why is it at the top of mind for you?
I think personally for me, it requires quite a bit of sophistication. And, when I've ultimately spent most of my career in kind of a cradle to grave situation where, you're not just coming in at, construction or leasing or permitting or, whatever, area you would like to talk about along that spectrum. So I think when you have to take a full large scale multifamily development project from conception right the way through delivery, there's so many nuances that go into that. And even just take, for example, the construction methodology, like that is just more of a sophisticated. I think if you were to look at it, across the whole spectrum of sectors, I would argue that maybe only hotel and something like life sciences or lab, can get as nuanced. So personally, I think that's why I was attracted to it and why I like to spend a lot of my time there. I did a little bit of industrial work when I was at AW and I've done a little bit of hotel stuff back in Ireland. But ultimately, it's just it's obviously going quite well in the US, which always helps at the moment, where cap rates are at and where demand is at. But so I think it's just probably, those two factors pushing together, it being a good space to be in from a business standpoint, but then also it being something that I genuinely enjoy and I'm interested in and is constantly evolving too, right? So it's not just as if, the industry or the stuff that the product type that we primarily spend our time has remained steady. It is just changing all the time. And you're constantly asking the questions as to how you can improve. And, is it something that our ultimately our residents are going to want to live in long term, or are we going to deliver something that's going to come out of fashion pretty quickly? So
Yeah.
it's pretty interesting for those two reasons.
And it is interesting. I mean, on one hand, it's homes for people to live in, and we live in a world, unfortunately, of great housing shortage, particularly of the quality that is required for, people to enjoy a comfortable standard of living. On the other hand, it is one of the oldest sectors. Certainly as an asset class out there, it's heavily picked over. There is a wall of capital looking at this space. Is it a sector where you can have sustained interest and expect returns? And if you think it is, why do you think it stays the course as an asset class that is investable into the future?
Yeah, I think it's a super question, right? And it's something we're always looking at. I think, if you look at it from a national level down, I think you really have to be focusing on population growth, migration, wages, employment. And you kind of have to constantly relate that in the sectors you're in, also in terms of availability of land and deal flow. So from that aspect, some cities, say like Phoenix or Las Vegas, is a completely different animal to what we have here, around the Boston or the Northeast. I think in Boston, we are a little bit spoiled in some ways because I think we've quite a natural supply-demand imbalance. If you look at the Boston area or the Northeast in general, half of it, first of all, is cut off by the Atlantic Ocean. Then you look at Boston and you have two natural, almost like belts around it. You have Route 128 and 495. So that creates, and obviously a supply issue. Then the further west you go, the state gets quite wet and quite rocky. So that delivers with its own problems. And then on top of that, the greater Boston area is a collection of individual towns and municipalities, all with their specific zoning and ordinances. So it's not as if it's just this one mass of land that can expand in any direction. So throw on top of that then that Boston has, I believe, 20 individual, it's from a healthcare standpoint, it is 20 hospitals, I think 4 of which are in the top 50 in the United States. You have 30 plus, higher level colleges and universities. And I want to say by the last count, 11 were in the top 100. Then on top of that, one thing that we've really leveraged off, or we're looking to leverage off, is the growth in the biotech and lab market. As of the latest rankings, it came out top ahead of San Francisco in terms of, I believe it got 10% of all. I can't remember the NIH. I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but it got 10% of all funding nationally. So all of those factors, really create quite a healthy demand. And if you can establish yourself, you can navigate that. And if you can, thankfully, like I was able to do, get in, learn the business, learn the nuances of the business, I think then you can provide a platform that ultimately will always be attractable to capital, because they're trying to break into quite a parochial market. And that's I think why we have had success, and ultimately we've been able to probably continue that for quite some time.
And that speaks to the long term. I mean, it's complicated and there's a lot of work in releasing opportunities, and that comes through clearly even from what you've said. Another massive factor in real estate, Sean, that for sure is going to impact the residential sector is how sustainability is going to be a major factor in everything happening, refurbishment, redevelopment moving forward. Is that something that's become a major factor for you with some of the schemes that you're looking at? And do you think it's going to change much about the attractiveness of this sector? I don't. And are you seeing the work that you're doing or the professional teams that you're working with being innovative? Do you think innovation will be driven from the US in this respect, or do you see that coming from somewhere else and then being onboarded into US real estate?
Yeah, it's a super question. And I think it's something that's evolving in real time. It's something that I've spent quite a bit of quite a bit of effort looking at and trying to relate it back to what we do. I think the influence comes from a lot of places, quite honestly. I think one that is quite common is that you will have a sustainability requirement that's driven from the local municipality. And I think that's good and that's healthy, provided there is a certain amount of flexibility around that. I think you'll see, I know within the city of Boston, you're doing a large project under the large project review process. You have a requirement to have LEED certification, or at least try and get some certification. From my experience, LEED is a fantastic certification to get. However, from our standpoint as multifamily developers, it's also the most difficult. First and foremost, because the actual filing fees that are required upfront when you're putting a lot of your capital at risk and using your own balance sheet to do so prior to bringing on debt or your third-party equity, you've quite a heavy burden to carry early. And not only that, the requirements as you move through construction and you're trying to guarantee cost certainty to your partners, it's a difficult one to manage. Personally, I think the ones that work best at the current time for multifamily in the US is NGBS and Green Globes. Both of those have a kind of a easier lift on the front end, like an easier upfront requirement, and they allow you to also like. I think some of these certifications, you have to be very conscious of what level you land at, because if you shoot too high, you could burden yourself with an obligation to deliver a building that you might not have cost certainty to do so. Does that make sense? I'm probably not.
Yeah, well, no, it does. But look, for everyone, it's a returns-based proposition when you're developing schemes like this. And I hear what you're saying. I mean, you've got to strive for as much as you can in terms of respecting the environment, but it's obviously it needs to be viable financially as well. I think that's what you're touching on. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's trying to marry everything together. Like, what does our end user want? Does our tenant really care about us having a certification? How do you balance that then with your obligation to your capital partners and deliver a return? And then ultimately, how do you pick something that actually benefits the environment? And the classic thing, sustainability, is where do they draw the box? How does that actually relate back to benefiting?
Yeah, Sean, that's a really, I think, a really interesting what you've just said there. Are there? I mean, I've always people, as I've watched the sustainability space in real estate for the last 15 years, the question that comes up time and time again is, when is green going to stand for dollars? And as unpleasant as it might seem, when a community, irrespective of what the community is incentivized to think in a more sustainable or environmentally friendly way, progress tends to happen a lot faster. I think that's really part of just the way of the world. Is there anything that's incentivizing tenants at the moment to look for a green development or a green property? And if not, do you agree that if there were measures in place, whether it's tax breaks or whatever, to encourage tenants to rent green rather than, just rent on historic criteria, which would of course be bundled in with green in the future anyway, do you think that would make a big positive difference and also help developers get best in market type projects up in terms of how they take care of the environment?
Definitely. And you hit the nail on the head. It really comes from the plan, right? If you surveyed, across all our prospective residents, again, specifically in relation to our market here, they're looking at where's it located, what's the product quality like, and what's the price. It's a tough vacancy within the greater Boston area. Per the Boston Globe report recently was at 1%. So, does that tenant have the luxury to be able to say, well, if it's not a Green Globe building, or if it's not NGBS, or if it's not LEED, I'm not moving in. However, if there was a government incentive that says, and claim back whatever 10% of the rent that you've paid throughout the life of your lease, when you move out, if you move into a green certified building, that would shake up everything. So I think it's a super idea, and not one that we're really seeing a lot of.
Just yet. Yeah.
Yeah.
And are you, I mean, Sean, maybe I'm reaching a bit here, but are local municipalities or the public sector bodies that are responsible for entitlement permissions and certification, do they have net zero goals or net zero targets? I mean, if they do, it probably stands to reason that they will eventually translate to this type of thinking and regulation around renting. But is that in place across the board yet, or is that something that's yet to come in the locations where you're focused?
Yeah, I think it's probably a little different for us again, because the idea of the greater Boston area being made up of all the individual municipalities. So you could be dealing with a town like Waltham, one cycle or for one project, or then you could be in Cambridge or Boston, which is, and you're talking a distance of a couple of miles in some instances. So obviously Cambridge carries the likes of MIT, Harvard. It is a completely different world to doing something 2 miles down the road. So yes, those municipalities most likely will force some sort of a sustainability or a green certification on you in some way, shape, or form. And that's honestly, when you know up front, you can do something about it. If you can ultimately understand and you're underwriting your deal and your feasibility, and you're something that's acutely aware of that, and you know exactly what you have to hit. At the end of the day, our business is all about certain delivering upon what you said you're going to do. So if you know up front that that's what you can do, you can incorporate that into the opportunity and assess the viability of that from the start. So that's not the end of the world. But I think where we're seeing probably an interesting wrinkle is actually more from the LP capital side. Oftentimes, whatever fund that the capital partner is ultimately choosing to fund our venture from, a lot of the time that prospectus will have a green or a sustainable requirement. And as a result, our building then has to be associated with something. So that's probably something I found in the last while that's changing quite a bit, is that more and more LP capital is looking to drive sustainability requirement on a building rather than the municipalities doing it. So it's interesting just where you see it coming from.
Yeah, and that is, and really, Sean, so in summary, it sounds like a lot of runway in this market, largely for the reasons that you mentioned earlier in the chit chat, but it also sounds really encouragingly that there's a whole evolution still to take place in the sector that can drive much more sustainable, environmentally friendly development, which I think is a real positive. And even better, that there's motivation, as you've just mentioned, in the private sector that will reach out to public authorities to bridge that gap and probably drive the type of change that we're talking about in the short term moving forward. It'll also make it a much more interesting development and refurbishment landscape.
I agree.
Before we wrap up, Sean, a slightly cheeky pivot from the closing question that I was going to ask you, but I got to ask you. We were going to talk about best in class residential. Your favorite multifamily or residential scheme of all that you've seen, which one do you like most?
That's a good question. That's a good question. Actually, the Echelon in the Seaport was delivered about 2 years ago now. That split both condos and apartments. And forgive me, I'm blanking on the name of the developer right now. It's a group from out of town, but they did it.
So this is the Echelon in the Boston Seaport. Okay, yeah, so we could look for you putting an offer down there sometime in the near future. Yeah,
yeah, I might try and I don't know if it'll be out of bounds, but I might try and take a look at it, because they just did it. I think you look through. Just to labor this point a little bit, I think when you're going through the cycle of a project, and if you are doing it the way we approach it, just kind of cradle to grave, right? Everything is in house and driven by a central team. I think what I really appreciate is the people that can pay attention to the details while also driving a project forward, because there are so many decisions, and to be able to carry that through and understand what the light outside your unit door looks like relative to lobby lights, and ultimately then coordinating that across hundreds of units is quite a challenge, a great challenge. But then when you see people who pull it off and do it well, it's really something else. Something I kind of geek out on, to be honest with you.
I'll be Googling myself after this conversation. But Sean Henry, it's been absolutely fantastic having you on the show, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Absolute pleasure, Gavin. Thank you.
So that's a wrap, and it just leaves it for me to thank you very much for tuning in and listening to our conversation. And as I mentioned at the beginning, if you'd like any information or you want to have a chat, drop me a line on Gavin R. Morgan at propnext.com, GAVINRMORGAN at propnext.com. Or there's more information, as I said earlier, too, on www.propnext.com. That's www.propnx.com. I look forward to speaking with you in future podcasts. And thank you again.